Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I hope I can share something useful about our experience in the United States. I'm also looking forward to learning from you and from my other colleagues on the panel. I've been in this field for about 30 years, redeveloping former industrial sites, chemical manufacturing, mining. In the US, we have a good track record of this. We have legislation, we have policies, we have regulations, we have financing, we have funding. But in nuclear, we don't. We've essentially got nothing that supports local economic development post-decommissioning. It's an issue that's been ignored, so I feel bad because we don't have the NDA. The NRC does not care about this issue. The NRC is a safety regulator. Economic development is not their issue. So, as a result of that, 5 years ago, I started the nonprofit, the Collaborative, to try and shed some light on the issue, to try and raise awareness, help people understand the plight of host communities. We wrote a report, which people have downloaded around the world. At least it's a start for us in the United States. And this is what led me to be here today. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear power in the United States, where it is, what it is, why it's where it is, how communities are responding. I have two examples, one in the US and one in Canada. We do work in Canada. Take a little bit of a look at energy plant redevelopment around coal and what they're doing, and lessons learned, and then some recommendations. Sorry. 20% of US capacity is nuclear. It's been consistent for a long time. There's no nuclear builds coming online. No big plants are being planned at all. There is talk of SMRs and those sorts of things, and we'll see how that compares. But the US government is very committed to keeping nuclear power plants operational. They've recently passed a $6 billion program to support existing plants, to keep them open longer, mostly for economic development and climate change reasons. There was a big peak around building nuclear power plants in the 70s and the 90s. 20-year licenses. Most plants now are about 40 years old, and many are being relicensed. We are seeing plants that are being licensed to 60 years, 40 years for sure. When a nuclear plant is sited in the United States, it's largely a federal process. The utility and the federal regulator decide where it's going to go. The community has a small role, but not much of a role. So when those plants are built a long time ago, there's still resentment in some areas about how the plant came to be. And that's important. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And same around decommissioning. In decommissioning, although there are community advisory boards that was mentioned earlier, they essentially have no power. So there's resentment in how communities respond or are being treated in the decommissioning process. And those two things are important as we talk about redevelopment. But I would say that in the United States, nuclear power has a history of low community involvement. Oops, I apologize. Here's a map of where the plants are. The red ones are closed or are being closed, and the green ones are open. We anticipate between 2030 and 2040 to see more plants come offline in kind of a peak, depending on the economics. But the total cost to decommission these green dots is about $100 billion. Let's talk a little bit about why plants are located where they are. First of all, the site is owned by the utility. It is owned by the private sector. They're big sites. The average site is over 800 hectares. and the industrial property is about 10% of that. 3/4 of the plants are in rural locations. They're in the country. They're in cornfields. And because of that, the plant has a very strong influence on local economies. Huge influence. An example is in Wiscasset, Maine. The plant operated for 24 years from 1972 to 96. It contributed 90% of local tax base for schools and public services, fire, police, libraries, swimming pools. The workers earned more than 50% more than local people in the region. And for decades, the town really benefited from this relationship. Who would not? You don't have to pay very high taxes, and you have great schools for your children. It was a wonderful relationship. And the identity of the town and the community and the plant was linked very, very, very closely. There's a phrase that we use in the US called a company town. Wiscasset was a company town. There's also another side to that story, in that in a company town, the company runs the town, but the town can't run itself. Now, I'm not being critical, but what that means is over time, if you keep getting all of your taxes paid and all the decisions driven by a big company, the town itself loses capacity on how to make its own decisions. They lose that muscle memory of how to administrate and manage a complex system. So that's just an example of the local impact. And just a drawing or some plant locations. You've got Maine, that's decommissioned completely. It's over 300 hectares. Zion we'll talk about more. It's 95% complete. It's on the shore of Lake Michigan. It's about 100 hectares. Cooper in Nebraska, 550 hectares. Dresden in Illinois, 400 hectares. These are large, large pieces of property owned by the utility, with a small piece is the industrial site. But these are massive, massive land ownerships. It's important to also understand the issue of nuclear waste in the United States. Right now, we do not have a functioning nuclear waste management program. We have 80,000 tons of fuel with no place to go. Work on Yucca Mountain was halted after $15 billion. A new repository could be multiple decades away. So right now, I'm also working with the Department of Energy on their interim storage facilities. We're aggressively trying to get a centralized storage place up and running by 2037. But even then, it will take decades to ship all the nuclear waste from where it is now to where it's going to go ultimately. So what does that mean? All the waste is stored on site at both operating and closed plants, and will be there for a very long time. Now, it's funny, the waste is owned by the utility, but it's the responsibility of the federal government to take care of it. So it's a lot of this right now. What does that look like? This is Zion Nuclear Power Plant on the shores of Lake Michigan, north of Chicago. The site's been cleaned, but the waste is in the little corner there. It's going to stay there for a very long time. So as far as closure and decommissioning goes, the process began in the 80s. 21 sites have gone through the process or are in the process now. Decommissioning in the US is a very specific thing. It's termination of the NRC license. The NRC allows the utilities up to 60 years from closure to decommission the plant. 6 decades to finish license termination. And again, not a lot of involvement from the host community at all, almost none. Community advisory boards are created, but they have no power. So you ask yourself, why would I go to a meeting where what I say doesn't matter? And that's an issue we're struggling with. But successful decommissioning in the US is very specific. It's 25 millirems to allow property disposition. At the end of the day, the property is still owned by the utility, and there is zero attention paid to local economic development. So I don't mean to be too informal, but in the US, this is success. You put a chain link fence around, you put some spent fuel, and you put a sign saying, stop, don't come in here. That is what the industry and the regulations are designed to do. I'm not being critical, but that's everybody's job. The job is terminate license, clean it up, put a fence around it, and the fuel is sitting there waiting for something else to happen at a later date. So if you take a bigger picture of it, a bunch of sites have been decommissioned. There's virtually no economic development happening at any of them. And you ask yourself, why? Well, why is that? Well, the utility has zero incentive to redevelop the site or to provide any economic development at all. Why? It's not their business. A utility is designed to generate electrons and make money on it. Once that's done, they have no role and no interest. And the presence of nuclear waste scares people. Nobody wants to redevelop a property next to a pile of nuclear waste. That waste will be there for a very long time. Nothing happens. You also have the 60-year schedule that they can drag out decommissioning or take as long as they want, up to 60 years. Again, host communities don't have any influence or power. And if you're in a rural location, what are you going to do at the site anyways? How are you going to redevelop that in the middle of a cornfield? So these circumstances have created opportunities and problems for a number of host communities. We'll look at two examples and one in Canada. Again, we go back to Zion, Illinois. It was sited in the 1970s. It was built in 1973. And when the plant was being sited, the mayor asked the utility, he said, I've heard of nuclear waste, what's going to happen to it? And the utility said, from the mayor, I spoke with the mayor, the utility said, don't worry about it. The government will take care of it. So the mayor said, okay, fine, build the plant, because he was promised in a handshake agreement the waste would be gone. That didn't happen. The plant closed in 1998. All the workers left. Housing prices plummeted. The tax payments to the town decreased by over half. The budget for the town fell apart. There was a big economic hole. And the town is now borderline insolvent. And they're angry because there's 130 hectares of property they could redevelop. There are even people who are now maybe talking about siting something a little bit away from the nuclear waste, but something, but they've got zero. And this has developed a lot of resentment. And there's a quote at the bottom by the mayor. You know, this plant closed 24 years ago, and the town is struggling. So that's, again, I'm not here to, well, I feel bad because I'm not in the UK. I can't point to the NDA. We don't have that. So I'm just giving you examples of where we are. There's a better example for what the future may hold, and that's Diablo Canyon on the west coast of the country. The plants came online in '85 and '86. They were running for about 30 years. They're currently scheduled to close in 24 and 25. But as I mentioned before, the $6 billion federal program to keep them running, they may continue to operate, but we don't know yet. We're still figuring that out. But the property is priceless. It's amazing property on the coast of California. If the owner of the plant, PG&E, did decommission the way they're supposed to, they would end up like Zion. They'd knock everything down, put a chain link fence around, call it a day. But a local community group in 2020 took a different approach. They realized closure was coming 4 years before it was actually taking place, and they wanted to promote economic development. They wanted to figure out what could be done differently this time at Diablo. And they wanted to propose a redevelopment operation or options to the utility where they could work together, where decommissioning and economic development could be thought of in the same sentence. And this process is still underway, and it's presently under consideration, but I'll describe it a little bit. It's very simple to bring people together and talk about what you want. The community group came together, but behind the scenes, it was very difficult to make that happen. It took 2 years of planning to get this community together to talk about the future use of Diablo Canyon. Why was that? Well, they weren't really involved in the siting of it. They didn't know anything about the plant. It was kind of a secret to everybody. It was a controversial facility. There were lots of people who didn't want the plant operational. It's a very sensitive issue. There are a lot of politics, a lot of unknowns. And so even getting people together to talk about the future of Diablo took 2 years worth of work. But once they were there, we had elected officials, labor, community groups, businesses, Indian tribes, even anti-nuclear activists came to the table to talk about the future. And that was very, very important. We wanted to build a collaborative discussion and dialogue around the future of Diablo. So we had workshops, and people voted with stickies and boards and all these sorts of things. But we also had independent experts, people who could advise. I've been in 1 million of these meetings, and everybody shows up with a wish list of what they want. But it has to be based in reality. What's economically viable? Who decides? What's the input? So that took place earlier this year. And as a result, and you see on the poster board outside, we came up with this. This is a community plan for the repurposing of Diablo Canyon. It has a lot of buy-in, a lot of public support, a lot of work. And the goal was simply to have a conversation, a series of productive, realistic dialogues about the future of the plan. So, what are some important pieces about the process? Now, again, we don't have a federal system that promotes these kinds of discussions. Through the work of the collaborative, we've been able to get some money to communities, and one of the local nonprofits picked that up and ran with it. It was their leadership that brought people together to start to figure out the future. We took a cooperative approach. We had to develop a reuse plan that the utility would find it was in their business interest to pursue. So what does that mean? What can an NGO with a reuse plan offer? What can they offer a utility? Well, California is a very interesting place to do business. It's very heavily regulated. The permitting process in California is probably the most complex in the nation. And here you have a utility that has to go through a very public permitting process, around decommissioning, and they could use some help from the local community. So the transactional model was, if we create a reuse plan that makes sense, that the utility can start to think of as it decommissions, maybe the community can also support the utility in its permitting process. What does that mean? That means the utility saves time, and time is money. So that was the approach here. And again, the process is still in its early stages. We've got some good traction, but the plant may be relicensed for another series, of many years, so we don't know how it's going to come out. But it's an example of a local NGO taking control of their own destiny. So they weren't necessarily a company town. They grew a backbone and tried to figure out their own future. We're also doing some work up in Whiteshell in Manitoba, in Canada. I love this site. Whiteshell was created by AECL as a research facility in Manitoba. It's at the end of the highway. It employed 1,000 people for about 30 years. The host community of Pinawa was built by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. AECL built the roads, they built the school, the houses, the gas station, the store. They built and designed everything. Pinawa lived off of AECL. There's a master agreement that codifies how much money the town gets every single year. And the town is holding on to that for dear life. AECL hired us to help with post-closure planning. The site was closure was announced in '98. The site will be decommissioned by 2027. That's 30 years. But if you walk the streets of Pinawa, not everybody at all, but many people refuse to believe it's going to close, or they refuse to believe the project will end. They refuse to even consider a future without AECL. They're reluctant to face what happens when Whiteshell really, really closes. I'm not being critical of them at all. They've grown up with Whiteshell. Their kids went to school, and the professors and the teachers were family members of Whiteshell employees. But the plant has closed, decommissioning will finish, and the question is, then what? And in this context, economic planning is very, very, very hard. And we have found that AECL needs to work very hard to help Pinawa help itself. By itself, Pinawa is not able to. It's very much a company town. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this little diagram because people often ask, you've been decommissioning in nuclear communities, there's a lot going on in the US. What are your lessons? And we struggled trying to describe what the lessons are, or how to sort of take away so people can plan for the future. And we came across this 5-step process, and I'm going to go through each one for a little bit. Number one, there's a very important rule. Every plant closes. That's not a popular thing to say, especially to people who are living with operating plants. Your plant's going to close one day. They don't want to talk about that. And in Pinawa, they don't want to talk about that at all. They don't want to talk about decommissioning and finishing. They want to keep that going on forever. And even in operating plants in the United States, we go to communities where the plants have announced closure or licenses will expire in 3 to 5 years. And we say to them, would you like to talk about economic planning now? And they close the door on us, as if talking about it will make it happen sooner, or talking about it makes it more real. Again, they've lived with a very prosperous environment for a long time, and they don't want to face that reality. So a lot of what we do when plants have closed, we go to communities, is we do one thing, is we listen. We listen to them just talk about what it feels like to have this plant close, to have their identity challenged. There's a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, and sometimes there's even shame. And you ask yourself, why is there shame? Well, they may have lived with a very prosperous plant for 40 years, but when it closes, they don't know what they have left. They don't know if they've saved enough or if they've developed the skills and resources to keep on going. And there's a tiny bit of embarrassment there that I see in a lot of communities where they realize the plant will close, but they haven't made the preparations for closure. And sometimes they realize they don't have enough time to make those preparations. And so when we work with these communities, it's very important to let them speak and to hear their story so we can then figure out how best to help them. And how best to help them, the next step 2, the impact assessment. This is a very painful part of the process because you have to do 2 things. First thing you have to do is figure out and model the socioeconomic impact of the plant with your host community. And if you ask every nuclear community in the United States, can you describe the impact that the plant has in your community? They can't do it. It's been around for so long, people have just gotten used to it. I show up, I don't pay a lot of taxes, and my roads are paved, everything's good. But to actually trace each dollar and figure out where it goes, that's a lot of work. Then the scary part is to figure out what happens when that stops and what that gap looks like. And oftentimes, you need a third party to come in and help have those conversations because they're very difficult. If you're going to lose half your budget, how do you respond? You lose half your budget and your tax base is disappearing and all your high-skilled workers have left. That's not an easy conversation to have. But then once they realize the gap in the US, then they get introduced to the decommissioning process itself. And the decommissioning process itself is entirely opaque to them. They think that the NRC will have their back as the federal agency, but they don't. So it's a rather unpleasant learning curve that they have to go through when they realize that decommissioning doesn't pay any attention to their host community needs. And so it's a rude awakening. It's a painful realization, and they come to the conclusion they can't do it alone. So then they reach out for partnership development like the folks in California did. They build coalitions, relationships, opportunities, and then they plan and execute a revitalization strategy. But that's the nutshell of what decommissioning looks like in the US from a community perspective. And just as an example, it's not too dissimilar to a lot of work that's been done in the coal communities for a long time. There's a closure, decommissioning, redevelopment phase. There's a lot of community engagement that goes on. There's financial assistance to coal communities that happens right away when closure happens. There's also technical assistance. Again, in the US, there's a regulatory system and a framework to address this. Not so much nuclear, but the relationship is very similar. So if you ask yourself what are some of the common themes that we see, it's not a surprise. Communities and plants have a very strong relationship together. It's been a way of life. And when closure starts to happen, the impacts are a surprise to many people. The impacts are unknown and unanticipated. Everybody uses the word change a lot. When your nuclear power plant closes and everybody leaves, that's a big change. We've also found that even those who have been opposed to the plant, they have to adapt as well. Their identity has been to oppose something. And once that something disappears, who are they? So it affects people in many different ways. Technical, financial, and cultural resources are important, time. But only after you accept closure can you have any real hope of any planning. And we've always found, we'll talk about stakeholders later, but we've always found that the whole system approach is the most important. It's the whole system, meaning everybody's in the room. As soon as you exclude people, oh, you don't live here, or you're too far away, or you haven't lived here long enough, that creates tension. I think in a future world, or not a future world, but a future scenario, you can use decommissioning, if done right, and redevelopment as a springboard to the future. Right now, it's very much viewed as an endpoint. And again, these are all very obvious and very straightforward as far as recommendations and best practices go. Transparency, planning, collaboration. There's nothing new here. But communities need resources. The dynamic in the United States around nuclear power plants is that as soon as the plant stops generating electricity, the tax payments almost stop overnight. There's an example of a plant, Kewaunee in Wisconsin. When it was operational, the plant was assessed at $500 million. That was the taxable amount, the taxable assessment amount for that plant. The minute the plant stopped producing electricity, the assessed value was zero. That was a big hit for the local community. And so they're in this situation where they have to start to plan, but there's no revenue and no income to plan to help planning. So they're stuck. That's where some of the shame comes in. So what we're working for in the US is to try and find ways to support host communities by tapping into maybe some federal resources to help for planning in the long term. And look, I'm an engineer, I'm a civil engineer, but the personal dimensions of this work are what are often overlooked, but I think are the most important. I'm not discounting civil engineering. It's a great profession, but the softer issues sometimes are very important to take into consideration. I view plant closure as a personal journey. It begins with despair and fear for the host community, for the workers, their families, the relationships. It's a devastating blow. Everybody reacts differently to closure and to change. And there's no one size, we're all going to come in and do it this way. It's a very organic, collaborative process. Some people want to start fixing the problem tomorrow. Others need some time to understand and adapt their approaches and systems to it. But time is important to give them, and resources are important. And the technical stuff is there, and the planning and all that is there, but you have to invest in the social and personal to begin with. This is all about relationships. Relationships matter. And if we can create those or honor those or reinforce those to begin with in the process, then you can have a more productive economic recovery in the future. I finished a little bit early. I apologize, but thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim-san. That's a very interesting presentation. I have one question from the online audience. His question is, what is the role of your company, the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative Link? So what kind of the organization or the company?
So 5 or 7 years ago, I was touring a lot of nuclear power plants, and I saw decommissioning happening, and I saw that it was very unproductive from a host community perspective. And I honestly felt that if industry could better understand this, they could decommission more efficiently and save money. And so I started this nonprofit to simply raise awareness of host communities. And as a result of that, federal legislation was created, or appropriations, and so money has been now allocated to host communities for the past 3 or 4 fiscal years. What we do is we help facilitate and help these host communities plan for economic recovery post-closure. So we're a consulting firm in a way, but we're also an NGO. And the NGO part is very important because we're not here to make money off host communities. We earn a reasonable fee, but the real goal is to strengthen and empower them. And so we do work all over the US, and then in Canada we were hired by AECL to help them figure out how to manage the White Shell Closure Project. I mean, utilities are great at doing one thing, generating electrons. When it comes to helping host communities plan for resiliency, that's not their skill set. And so that's what we do. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. So, じゃあ、会場の方からちょっとご質問等いただきたいと思います。少し会場を明るくしていただいて、例えば福井県さんの方からちょっとご質問ありますか。じゃあお願いします。すいません、ちょっとマイクのところへ行っていただけませんか。すいません。
福井県の三寺と申します。2つ質問させていただきます。1つ目は、核のゴミの管理のことなんですけれども、これは国の方が管理すると。で、所有権はその電力事業者という話があったかと思うんですけれども、これ日本ですと両方とも電力事業者が責を負うということなんですけれども、アメリカでその国が管理するというのは何か核の安全保障とかそういう絡みがあるのか、どういった理由で国が管理するのかという一つ目の質問です。
じゃあ一つずついきましょうか。
Thank you for that question. It's a very good question, and everybody in the United States asks the same question. And the reason is that when the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was created in 1987, and before that, the Atomic Energy Act, it said the federal government shall dispose of nuclear waste. And that's the law. And that's the only answer I have. Now, when a utility buys uranium fuel, they can buy it, and they can put it in the reactor, and it can generate heat, and they still own it once it's spent. But it's the federal government's job to take that fuel and put it somewhere. They were supposed to start doing that in 1998. It's 2022. There's nothing. It's been a very challenging process in the United States, but that split between utility ownership and federal disposal has created substantial problems in the United States, and many people would like to go back and write a different law and change the approach. Thank you for your question.
ありがとうございます。もう1点なんですけれども、アメリカですと、その地元の住民とか自治体の方が、あまりその恩恵を受けられないというか、日本ですと、例えば、建設はもちろん再稼働とか、廃止措置についても、地元の同意を得て、電力事業者がやっていくと、一緒にやっていくという観点があるので、電力事業者は常にその立地地域との共生っていう点で非常にいろんな工夫をしたり努力をされている、そこは非常にありがたいなと思うんですけれども、アメリカではそういう動きが今もずっとないままで、これからももうそんな、地元への何か貢献とかそういうアクションというのはもう全く起こらないような感じなんでしょうか。
Thank you for that question. Two things. One is there's a new business model in the United States for decommissioning nuclear power plants, where the utility will sell everything to a contractor. So they'll sell the plant, they'll sell the nuclear waste, they'll sell the land, and the contractor will come in and do the decommissioning. Now, if the utility had done the decommissioning, they've been there for 40 years, they have relationships, they have friends in the community, the utility knows them, or the community knows the utility. But if you sell it to a third party, there's no relationship there. And so the contractor doesn't necessarily value or care about those relationships. They'll be gone in a period of time. And they bring in a mobile workforce. They're temporary for 3 to 5, 7 years, and they all leave. So the utilities value the relationship with host communities, but when they sell the plant to another party, that relationship is severed. And thirdly, a lot of these plants are in the countryside. There's no local workforce to draw upon for decommissioning. It's very specialized, so people come in and then they leave. Thank you.
はい、貴重なお話ありがとうございました。
多分法律の仕組みが違うんだと思うんですが、日本の場合だともう事業者がずっと責任を持って廃止措置までやって、廃棄物の処分についてはその専門の事業者に渡すところまでは電力事業者が責任を持つことになっています。で、売ってしまうプラントを丸ごと売ってしまうというのは多分日本では許されていないと思うんですが、それはもう完全に法律の違いという理解でよろしいんでしょうか。よし、じゃあ他にご質問とかコメントとかございませんでしょうか。
こちらですかね。福井大学の井口と申します。ちょっと日本語で。廃止措置後の、サイトの利用に関してですね、いくつか例を教えていただきましてありがとうございます。で、少し以前はですね、更地にしておしまいといったところはアメリカもあったと思うんですけども、ちょっと最近のニュースでは、さっき廃止措置の専業会社とありましたけれども、そこが新しい発電所を作るといったような、例がですね、これはまだ計画なんでしょうけども、という話も、ちょっと私、ニュースで聞いているんですけども、こういう動きっていうのは非常にアメリカはダイナミックでいいなと思っていますが、ハミルトンのちょっとご意見をいただければと思います。
Thank you for the question. The only answer I have is that we will see. I think what the business model is for the decommissioning contractors who have new nuclear technology in their pipeline is we're going to go buy all these sites. We're going to decommission them at our own pace, and we'll see if it's an opportune time to introduce small modular reactors. They're not at all considering any host community benefit issues at all in that planning. It's all very centralized. It's all very tightly controlled. It may be a good business model for them. I don't know. The deployment of SMRs in the United States, I can't forecast when that's going to happen. All I'm looking at is the next 10 to 15 years, and I just see companies buying the plants, buying the sites, decommissioning them, and then not really paying attention until the SMR technology picks up. And even if the SMR technology becomes viable, it will employ much less at the reactors than the former reactor did. So it is a dynamic and a positive approach. I think the jury is still out as to whether or not how much of that has an impact on host communities. And all we're trying to do is influence the process so we can have something in between that 10 or 15-year period so that we can keep the community propped up in the process. Thank you for your question.
All right. So almost the same question came from the online audience, Mr. Fukazawa. And another question from Mr. Takeuchi of the online audience. So I think mechanisms such as the Diablo process is an example of vigorous effort by stakeholders, including the representatives of the residents, the power company, and the local government. So is there any system stakeholders who were willing to strongly promote such mechanism? So what is the incentive to make such a Diablo process?
Thank you for the question. What's the incentive to chart your own course for the future? What is your incentive to plan for resiliency? It is host communities realizing that nobody else is going to do that and that they need to step up. In some instances, 10 or 15 years ago, the systems weren't in place or the knowledge wasn't there. We're still fairly new in the United States helping people understand this dynamic. 10 years ago, they didn't know they could do anything about it. So now we're seeing with Diablo, and we're seeing it elsewhere, where communities are starting to get involved earlier and earlier, and they're raising their hands saying, you might close in 5 years, I want to start planning now. And they're seeking resources from the federal government, from the state government, from philanthropic organizations. It's again, if you've lived for 40 years with a plant producing electrons and a lot of tax base, you don't need to think about this. But now they're starting to see plants close, or they're starting to see energy transitions happening, and they're beginning to take more control over their destiny. So the incentive is there are now people that can turn to. There's a community of practice out there. There are people who've gone through this. Our primary message to everybody we work with is you're not alone. They all feel alone when it starts. They feel that nobody else has ever done this before. But if you can point to 4 or 5 other people who've gone through it, then they feel more able to start to plan and lead the process.
So his question is, who proposes such kind of activity?
Who? The local community does.
Oh, local community.
The federal government doesn't do it. The state government doesn't necessarily do it, but the local communities are the one who drive the action.
Thank you very much. So other questions? Okay, so thank you very much. It's a nice presentations and answers.